At 9:30 a.m. on March 16th, 1951, FBI Special Agent Robert McQueen watched Theodore Alvin Hall walk into the FBI field office in Chicago. 25 years old, Harvard graduate at 18, youngest physicist ever recruited to the Manhattan Project, the man who'd given Stalin the atomic bomb. Hall had agreed to come voluntarily. No arrest, no handcuffs, just questions. McQueen knew the truth. Intercepted Soviet cables proved it beyond doubt. Hall had handed over complete specifications for the plutonium bomb, the implosion trigger, purification processes, everything. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949, years ahead of American estimates. Hall's intelligence made it possible, but McQueen also knew something else. Without a confession, they had no case. The Venona decrypts couldn't be used in court without exposing that America had cracked Soviet codes. And Hall's courier, Saville Sachs, would never talk. Hall sat down across from McQueen, thin, pale, nervous but composed. McQueen had one shot: get him to confess, or watch him walk out a free man. The interview lasted 3 hours. Hall denied everything. At 12:45 p.m., Hall stood up, reached for his coat, walked to the elevator, every step waiting for handcuffs, for someone to stop him. Nobody did. The elevator came. He stepped inside, went down, walked out onto the Chicago street. Free. The man who gave away America's greatest secret would never spend a single day in prison. He'd die 48 years later in Cambridge, England, honored as a pioneering biophysicist. His espionage remained hidden for 44 years. This is the story of how an 18-year-old physics prodigy decided to save the world by betraying his country. And got away with it. October 20th, 1925, Far Rockaway, Queens, New York. Theodore Alvin Holtzberg was born to Barnett and Rose, Jewish immigrants who'd fled Russian pogroms. His father worked as a furrier. His mother died when Theodore was young. The Great Depression crushed the family business. Even as a child, Theodore showed extraordinary mathematical ability. His older brother Edward, 11 years his senior, tutored him. By age 14, Theodore had scored among the highest marks ever recorded on Columbia University's entrance exam. Too young to enroll, he attended Queens College instead. At 16, he transferred to Harvard as a junior, having already completed 2 years of college coursework. The family changed their surname from Holtzberg to Hall during this period. Professional survival. Anti-Semitism in 1940s America meant Jewish names, closed doors. At Harvard, Theodore Hall excelled in physics, relativity, quantum mechanics. His professor, John Van Vleck, recognized genius. Van Vleck had been secretly recruited by J. Robert Oppenheimer for a classified project. Hall's Harvard roommate was Saville Sachs, also brilliant, also Jewish. Both were involved in left-wing politics, the Young Communist League, Marxist study groups. They watched Nazi Germany's rise with horror. They watched Stalin's Russia with hopeful naivete. Hall joined the John Reed Society, Harvard's socialist organization. He defended Stalin's 1939 pact with Hitler. He believed in the Soviet experiment, believed it represented humanity's best hope against fascism. Sachs would later tell his son that his father looked up to Stalin, believing he would end anti-Semitism. They were wrong. But at 17, 18 years old, surrounded by Depression trauma and European fascism, they believed it with the fervor of youth. Hall graduated from Harvard at 18. In early 1944, he received a mysterious summons. A government interview. Very secret, they said. Very important to the war effort. No details. Hall told only one person where he was going. Saville Sachs. Sachs's response was immediate. If they're building some terrible weapon, tell the Russians. January 28, 1944, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Theodore Hall arrived at the Manhattan Project headquarters at age 18 years, 3 months. The youngest physicist ever recruited to build the atomic bomb. Security clearance granted without difficulty despite his left-wing publications. Wartime urgency outweighed caution. Hall was assigned to the implosion group, the team working on Fat Man, the plutonium bomb. His job? Testing and refining the complex implosion system needed to compress plutonium into a critical mass. The physics was brutally difficult. A hollow sphere of high explosive had to compress a plutonium core with perfect symmetry. Any asymmetry, and the plutonium would squirt out uselessly. 32 detonators had to fire simultaneously within a fraction of a microsecond. Hall's supervisors called him amazingly brilliant. By age 19, he was put in charge of his own research team, working alongside Nobel Prize winners, testing explosive lenses, calculating compression ratios, measuring neutron multiplication. He also helped determine the critical mass of uranium for Little Boy, the gun-type bomb. Hall had access to everything. Los Alamos was a small, tight community. Information flowed freely among scientists. Security focused on keeping secrets from leaving the facility, not on compartmentalization within it. By summer 1944, the war's trajectory became clear. Germany was losing. Nazi Germany would never build an atomic bomb. The German nuclear program had stalled years earlier. So who was this bomb really for? Hall attended a dinner in June 1944. Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, addressed the assembled physicists. Groves said something that shocked the room. The real target of the atomic bomb was the Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, the nation losing millions fighting the Nazis. That was the real enemy, Groves said. Joseph Rotblat, a Polish physicist, quit the Manhattan Project immediately. Niels Bohr and Leo Szilard tried to petition Roosevelt and Truman to inform the Soviets about the bomb project. They failed. Hall listened, processed, drew conclusions. An American monopoly on atomic weapons with a fascist sympathizing military aimed at the Soviet Union. He convinced himself it was wrong, dangerous, potentially catastrophic. He was 18 years old, brilliant but naive, idealistic but catastrophically misjudging Soviet Russia, and he made a decision that would shape the next 50 years of global history. October 15th, 1944. Hall requested leave to visit his family in New York for his 19th birthday. Approved without question. The truth, he planned to contact Soviet intelligence. He met with Saville Sachs in New York. They discussed how to make contact. Sachs suggested approaching Art Kino, a Soviet cultural propaganda organization. Sachs went to Art Kino with his story. A teenage genius working on America's top-secret superweapon wanted to share information with the Soviets. Skepticism. Who was this kid? Was this an FBI provocation? But they gave Sachs a name, Sergei Kurnikov, a Soviet journalist covering military affairs. Hall and Sachs each made separate contact with Kurnikov. Each carried information about Los Alamos, names of scientists, descriptions of the facility, basic facts about the bomb project. Kurnikov was a low-level NKVD agent operating without diplomatic cover. He met Hall on October 17, 1944. Hall, tall and thin, wearing dirty boots, hair falling across his forehead, handed over a written report. Kurnikov was described in Soviet files as immediately recognizing the value. This pimply-faced kid was the real thing. Hall's report detailed the organization of work at Los Alamos, key personnel, and basic science behind the implosion bomb. Sachs delivered a copy of the same report to the Soviet consulate days later, using the cover story of inquiring about relatives in the Soviet Union. November 12, 1944, a Soviet cable transmitted from New York to Moscow, later decrypted by American code breakers. B.E. Kate visited Theodore Hall, 19 years old, the son of a furrier. He is a graduate of Harvard University. As a talented physicist, he was taken on for government work. At the present time, H is in charge of a group at Camp 2. He handed over to BK a report about the camp and named the key personnel employed on Enormous: Beck, Sergei Kurnikov, Theodore Hall, Theodore Hall. Camp 2, Los Alamos. Enormous, the Manhattan Project. Hall was assigned the codename MLAD, Russian for Young One. Sachs was assigned the codename Star, Russian for Old One. The irony: Sachs was older than Hall. Moscow Center received Hall's report with intense interest, but also suspicion. Was this disinformation? An elaborate American trap? They needed confirmation. Within months, Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist also working at Los Alamos, independently provided similar information. Fuchs didn't know about Hall. Hall didn't know about Fuchs. At least 2 other unidentified spies were also active in the Manhattan Project. When Fuchs's information matched Hall's, Moscow knew both were legitimate. Hall and Sachs devised a communication code based on Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Poem numbers and line numbers corresponded to meeting dates and locations. Sachs would travel to Albuquerque, the nearest city to Los Alamos, to collect Hall's reports. Hall couldn't meet Soviet agents directly without raising suspicion. The logistics were crude. Hall couldn't remove documents from Los Alamos. Everything had to be memorized or rewritten. He used invisible ink, writing on the back of innocuous documents. Technical specifications, measurements, diagrams drawn from memory. February 1945. Hall passed detailed information about the implosion trigger to Sachs in Albuquerque, the explosive lens design, the timing mechanisms, the compression dynamics of plutonium. This was the heart of the bomb, the innovation that made a plutonium device possible. March 1945. Hall passed information about plutonium purification processes, the techniques developed at Los Alamos to extract weapons-grade plutonium from reactor fuel. Spring 1945. Sachs returned to Harvard full-time to finish his degree. He could no longer serve as courier. The Soviets assigned a professional, Lona Cohen, a committed communist operating under deep cover in New York. Cohen traveled to Albuquerque multiple times, waiting outside a church. The meetings were carefully choreographed but amateur by professional standards. August 1945. Cohen met Hall outside a church in Albuquerque. 4 previous Sundays she'd waited. Hall, confused about dates, didn't show. Finally, on the 5th Sunday, he appeared. He handed her a report containing complete specifications for the Fat Man bomb. Technical drawings, measurements, the full implosion design. Cohen, clever and cautious, concealed the documents inside a Kleenex box. She boarded a train back to New York. Not an airplane. Trains had less security. The tissue box trick became legendary in Soviet spy circles. She delivered the package to Anatoly Yatskov, the KGB New York station chief. Yatskov transmitted it to Moscow using one-time pad encryption. August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. Little boy detonated. 140,000 dead. August 6th, 1945. Los Alamos. Hall met with his new Soviet handler for the first and only time. The same day as Hiroshima. They discussed ongoing intelligence. Hall's work continued. August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki. Fat Man detonated. 70,000 dead. The bomb Hall helped design. The bomb he'd described in complete detail to Soviet intelligence. Hall read the reports, saw the photographs, the mushroom clouds, the devastation. His reaction is lost to history. His wife Joan, whom he married in 1947, said he told her he'd made his decision deliberately, after much thought. He believed a Soviet bomb would create balance, would prevent American nuclear blackmail. Whether he felt guilt about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we don't know. What we know, he continued spying, June 1946. Hall's security clearance was revoked, not because anyone suspected espionage, because overworked censors finally noticed left-wing publications he'd been receiving at Los Alamos, and because his British sister-in-law had written a joking letter. I hear you're working on something that goes up with a big bang. Can you send us one for Guy Fawkes Day? Suspicious enough for revocation, not suspicious enough for investigation. Hall received an honorable discharge from the Army's Special Engineering Detachment. He even received a citation from President Truman for his contributions to the Manhattan Project. Fall 1946. Hall moved to Chicago, enrolled at the University of Chicago for graduate studies in physics. He continued passing information to Soviet intelligence, now about the hydrogen bomb being developed at Chicago, Edward Teller's superweapon, a fusion device thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Hall maintained intermittent contact with Soviet handlers through the late 1940s. The exact nature of what he passed during this period remains classified or unknown. Hall married Joan, a fellow University of Chicago student. He told her about his espionage during their marriage. She kept his secret. They had 3 daughters. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Hall's intelligence was being put to use. Igor Kurchatov, head of the Soviet atomic bomb program, received reports from multiple spies. Hall's intelligence, Fuchs's intelligence, David Greenglass's cruder drawings, Kurchatov's greatest fear, that he was being fed disinformation, that Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's brutal secret police chief overseeing the bomb project, would have him shot for falling for American deception. But when Hall's intelligence matched Fuchs's independently, Kurchatov knew both were real. The Soviets used the information to shortcut years of research. They didn't simply copy the American design. They had their own brilliant scientists. But Hall's and Fuchs's intelligence confirmed their calculations, eliminated dead ends, accelerated the timeline. August 29, 1949, Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. The Soviet Union detonated RDS-1, their first atomic bomb. The design closely resembled Fat Man, the implosion mechanism, the explosive lens arrangement, the plutonium core. American intelligence estimated the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb until the mid-1950s at earliest. They were off by 5 years. President Truman announced the Soviet test to a shocked American public in September 1949. The nuclear monopoly was over. The arms race had begun. And in Chicago, Theodore Hall read the news. He'd succeeded. Soviet Russia had the bomb. Balance of power achieved. The cost would become clear later. January 1950. American cryptanalysts working on the Venona project, the effort to decrypt Soviet intelligence cables from the 1940s, achieved a breakthrough. One cable from November 12, 1944, mentioned Theodore Hall and Saville Sachs by name. Full names in a cable was a rare Soviet mistake. Other cables referred to M.L. Eddy and Starr but never gave identifying details sufficient for prosecution. But this one cable was enough. It described a 19-year-old Harvard graduate furrier's son working at Los Alamos. Theodore Hall fit perfectly. April 1950. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received the Venona evidence. 3 months before Julius and Ethel Rosenberg would be arrested as Soviet atomic spies, Hoover learned about Hall. By any measure, Hall was a bigger fish than the Rosenbergs. Hall had direct access to bomb designs. The Rosenbergs' network provided cruder, less detailed information through David Greenglass, a machinist. But there was a problem. Hall's older brother, Major Edward Nathaniel Hall, was now the Air Force's top rocket scientist. Edward Hall was designing engines for the Atlas and Titan ICBMs. More importantly, he'd created the revolutionary Minuteman solid-fuel ICBM concept. Edward Hall was essential to American strategic defense. J. Edgar Hoover wanted to prosecute Theodore Hall, but General Joseph F. Carroll, head of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and a former Hoover aide, had other priorities. Carroll feared that arresting Theodore during the McCarthy-era hysteria would force the Air Force to furlough Edward. The political pressure would be impossible. The brother of a Soviet atomic spy designing America's ICBMs? Congress would demand his removal. The Air Force couldn't afford to lose Edward Hall. He was irreplaceable. Letters between Hoover and Carroll obtained through FOIA requests in 2020 reveal the behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Carroll effectively blocked Hoover's investigation. But Hoover persisted. He had to at least try. March 16, 1951, FBI agents separately summoned Theodore Hall and Saville Sachs for questioning, Hall in Chicago. Sachs, now a taxi driver, also in Chicago. The Harvard roommates remained close friends. Special Agent Robert McQueen interrogated Hall. McQueen had worked other espionage cases. He knew the playbook. Get corroborating evidence, build the case systematically, but there was no corroborating evidence. No Harry Gold linking Hall to Soviet handlers, as there was in the Rosenberg case. No physical evidence. No witnesses willing to testify. Just the Venona cable, which couldn't be introduced in court without revealing that America had broken Soviet codes. Alan H. Belmont, number 3 man in the FBI, made the calculation. Venona intercepts were inadmissible hearsay. Exposing the program wasn't worth convicting one spy, even one who'd given away the atomic bomb. McQueen pressed Hall for 3 hours. Hall denied everything. No contact with Soviets, no espionage, no knowledge of any intelligence activities. His answers were quick, intelligent, lawyerly, without being defiant. McQueen was convinced Hall was guilty, absolutely certain, but he couldn't prove it in court. Hall stood, walked out, waiting at every moment for arrest. It never came. Sachs, interviewed separately, also denied everything. He'd go to his grave in 1980, never admitting his role. June 12, 1951. FBI agents, monitored by an Air Force OSI officer, questioned Edward Hall. The questions were restricted to matters involving Edward himself, not his brother Theodore. Edward Hall passed the Air Force's loyalty investigation. Within weeks, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. In 1999, the year Theodore died, the Air Force inducted Edward Hall into the Air Force Space and Missile Hall of Fame, honored for his work on the Minuteman missile, the backbone of America's nuclear triad. The irony is almost unbearable. One brother gave the Soviets the atomic bomb. The other designed the ICBMs to deliver American nuclear weapons to Soviet targets. After the 1951 interrogation, Theodore Hall severed all contact with left-wing organizations. He focused on his career, his family, his physics research. He completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago, pioneered techniques in X-ray microanalysis. But the FBI's interest, though blocked at the highest levels, made life in America uncomfortable. Hall accepted a position at the Cavendish Laboratory, Cambridge University, England. Initially planned as a 1-year sabbatical, he never returned to America permanently. While renewing his British work visa, Hall was contacted by an MI5 agent. A suggestion, ease your conscience, confess. Hall refused. MI5 dropped the matter. British intelligence knew about his past but decided not to pursue it. Perhaps they'd reached the same conclusion as the FBI, insufficient evidence for prosecution. Perhaps they valued his scientific work. Hall remained at Cambridge for the rest of his life. At Cambridge, Hall switched from nuclear physics to biophysics, electron microscopy, X-ray microanalysis of biological tissue. He developed the Hall method of continuum normalization, a breakthrough technique for analyzing thin tissue sections. He helped establish Cambridge's biological microprobe laboratory. His colleagues described him as generous with beginners, always ready to share knowledge, a soft-spoken, diffident man who treasured his scientific reputation. He published 166 scientific papers. An international reputation as a pioneer in biological microanalysis. His past remained hidden. The Venona project was classified. The few people who knew his secret stayed silent. Hall and Joan raised their 3 daughters in Cambridge. A quiet suburban life. Garden parties. University events. Scientific conferences. Nobody suspected that the mild-mannered biophysicist had once been the youngest atomic spy in history. FBI agents in Boston interviewed Roy Glauber, Hall's former Harvard classmate and Los Alamos colleague. They asked if Hall had ever mentioned contact with Soviets. Glauber, protecting his old friend, lied, said he knew nothing. Glauber would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2005. He kept Hall's secret for decades. July 1995, the Venona project was declassified. Nearly 3,000 Soviet intelligence cables from the 1940s released to the public, among them references to MLAD and STAR. The November 1944 cable naming Theodore Hall. February 25, 1996. The Washington Post identified Theodore Hall as the atomic spy codenamed MLAD. Hall, now 70 years old, living quietly in Cambridge, was suddenly thrust into public attention. Reporters contacted him. He declined to comment directly, wouldn't confirm or deny. But pressure mounted. His identity was public. His daughters were adults. His scientific career was essentially over, having retired in 1984 at age 59. Hall issued a carefully worded written statement, not quite a confession, an oblique admission. In the immediate post-war years, I felt strongly that an American monopoly on nuclear weapons was dangerous and should be avoided. To help prevent that monopoly, I contemplated a brief encounter with a Soviet agent just to inform them of the existence of the A-bomb project. I anticipated a very limited contact. With any luck, it might easily have turned out that way, but it was not to be. Hall gave an interview for CNN's Cold War documentary series. He went further. I decided to give atomic secrets to the Russians because it seemed to me that it was important that there should be no monopoly, which could turn one nation into a menace and turn it loose on the world as Nazi Germany developed. There seemed to be only one answer to what one should do. The right thing to do was to act to break the American monopoly. He never expressed regret, never apologized, maintained to his death that he'd acted from idealism, not treason. Journalists Joseph Albright and Marcia Kunstel interviewed Hall extensively for their 1997 book, Bombshell. Hall cooperated, though carefully. He acknowledged the broad outlines, never admitted specific operational details. The FBI's final memo on Hall's case, dated February 1, 1956, listed prosecution disadvantages. The Venona evidence was inadmissible. Key witnesses were dead or in the Soviet Union. The case was considered closed without charges. By the 1990s, with the Cold War over and Hall elderly, there was no appetite for prosecution. The statute of limitations had long expired, and Hall was living in England, outside American jurisdiction. November 1, 1999, Cambridge, England. Theodore Hall died of renal cancer at age 74. He'd also suffered from Parkinson's disease in his final years. The renal cancer was likely caused by his work with plutonium at Los Alamos. Testing the Trinity device, handling radioactive materials with 1940s safety protocols. He was survived by Joan and two of their 3 daughters. His obituary in the New York Times called him a prodigy and atomic spy. The Guardian described him as the U.S. scientist spy who escaped prosecution. His scientific colleagues remembered him as a pioneer in biological X-ray microanalysis. His work on electron microscopy was genuinely groundbreaking, but history will remember him for something else. The youngest spy in the Manhattan Project, the teenager who gave Stalin the atomic bomb, the one who got away. What was the cost of Theodore Hall's espionage? There were no executions. Hall didn't betray individual agents like Aldrich Ames would decades later. His intelligence didn't directly cause deaths, but the strategic consequences were enormous. The Soviet atomic bomb, tested in August 1949, was heavily influenced by information from Hall and Klaus Fuchs. American estimates were off by approximately 5 years. 5 years during which the United States held a nuclear monopoly. 5 years during which Stalin might have been deterred from certain aggressive actions. Instead, emboldened by nuclear parity, Stalin pursued more aggressive policies in Europe and Asia. The Korean War began in June 1950, less than a year after the Soviet bomb test. The nuclear arms race accelerated. Both sides developed hydrogen bombs by the mid-1950s. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction emerged. Whether this made the world safer, as Hall believed, or more dangerous, is still debated by historians. What's not debatable, Hall's actions fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. Fuchs provided more detailed and voluminous intelligence than Hall. David Greenglass provided cruder but still useful information. Other unidentified spies also contributed, but Hall was first. His October 1944 intelligence arrived before Fuchs's. His information about the implosion trigger was crucial, and Hall was the only scientist who provided bomb design details and was never prosecuted. Fuchs was caught in 1950, convicted in Britain, served 9 years. Greenglass was caught as part of the Rosenberg investigation, testified, served 10 years. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953, though their actual contribution was less significant than Hall's or Fuchs's. Hall lived free, honored, his scientific reputation intact until the 1995 Venona revelations. The irony piled upon irony. Hall feared American fascism. America never became fascist. He believed Soviet Russia represented humanity's best hope. Soviet Russia murdered millions, repressed its people, collapsed in 1991. He wanted to prevent nuclear war through balance. The nuclear standoff brought humanity to the brink multiple times. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. We survived by luck as much as deterrence. His brother Edward designed the weapon systems that would have delivered American nuclear strikes on Soviet targets, while Theodore had given the Soviets the bomb itself. Two brothers, both brilliant, both serving causes they believed in, one celebrated, one hidden. Hall spent decades justifying his actions, to Joan, to his daughters, to himself. In his final interviews, he maintained he'd done the right thing, that American nuclear monopoly would have been worse than the arms race that actually occurred. We'll never know. History doesn't offer controlled experiments. What we know, Hall bet on Soviet Russia. He was wrong about the nature of Stalin's regime, but he was right that nuclear monopoly was dangerous. Whether preventing that monopoly through espionage was justified remains one of the most contested moral questions of the Cold War. Hall's story is taught at intelligence training facilities today. The CIA, the FBI, counterintelligence courses around the world. The lessons. Ideological motivation is powerful. Hall didn't betray for money. He received no payment. He acted from conviction. Youth and idealism can be catastrophically naive. At 18, 19 years old, Hall thought he understood geopolitics better than presidents and generals. Security clearances based solely on technical competence are insufficient. Hall's political leanings were known but ignored due to wartime urgency. The insider threat is the most dangerous threat. Hall had legitimate access. He didn't need to break in. He was invited in. Even brilliant people can hold contradictory beliefs. Hall saw American potential for fascism but Soviet reality and convinced himself America was the greater danger. His name appears in no public memorials, no monument honors him. Soviet Russia, which he served, collapsed and is gone. The atomic bomb he helped design and describe ended World War II, but cast a shadow over human civilization that persists today. 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons. The doctrine of deterrence remains policy. The weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. Hall believed he was preventing catastrophe. Whether he created it or prevented it, we still don't know. What we know, an 18-year-old Harvard graduate made a decision in 1944 that changed the world. He gave away America's greatest secret, and he was never punished for it. He walked out of that FBI office in March 1951 and lived another 48 years. Free. If this story fascinates you, hit that like button right now. Every like helps YouTube show this to more people who need to understand how one teenager's decision rippled through decades of history. Subscribe and click the bell. We're pulling Cold War espionage stories from declassified archives every week. Real spies. Real consequences. Stories that changed the world. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you think Hall was a traitor or an idealist. Tell me if nuclear deterrence made us safer or brought us closer to destruction. Or just type, never forget, so I know you're here. This community is thousands strong, from dozens of countries. You're not just watching, you're part of preserving these stories. Share this video. Text it to someone interested in Cold War history. Post it. Tweet it. These stories need a wider audience. Theodore Hall gave away the atomic bomb at age 19 and was never caught. That's not fiction, that's history, and it's a reminder that intelligence isn't wisdom, brilliance isn't judgment, and good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure this story stays alive in memory. See you in the next story.